A land of magic, adventure, treasure, and danger. Strangers meet and rise to be heroes to save the land from a common enemy. This is a large draw to Dungeons and Dragons, to be a hero immersed in a magical adventure. How do you play such a game? Well, it's a tabletop role playing game. In simple terms, a group of people systematically create a character and pretend they're in a different setting. They describe what their character is doing while someone narrates a story for them and determining whether or not they succeed by rolling a 20-sided dice. This is a game people use to relax and have fun with a group of friends. Rolling a dice to see what happens adds a lot of spontaneity to the game. I'll insert a clip as an example. Nolan, you are surrounded by these two creatures. If I roll a 10 or higher, they will hit you and you will die. You're safe for now. They rolled a 7. Pretty much it. The rest that happens in the game depends on what the players decide to do in the world and what the narrator is doing with the story.
What do you do? I'm gonna shoot bow with my crossbow.
That doesn't seem like a very good idea.
Oh, I missed.
The game is so heavily dependent on the imagination and participation of players, and considering that someone is creating a story that the rest of the group are in, this leaves a lot of room for biases to seep into the game, especially if using pre-written content published by the company. The depictions shown in Dungeons and Dragons of various races and stereotypes contribute to D&D community's divided outlook on race and the lack of safe spaces for BIPOC within the community, further damaging those members. As a disclaimer, I'm not saying that all white people are the same, nor am I saying one person represents them all. In the future, going forward with this project, referencing Caucasians or white people specifically refers to a general group that has been studied in one of my peer-reviewed sources. Now, specifically, the races in D&D that are being brought up are Drow and Orcs. These are the races that the Wizards of the Coast, the company that owns Dungeons and Dragons, has described to be, end quote, painfully reminiscent of how these real-world ethnic groups have been and continue to be denigrated, end quote. Orcs are depicted to travel in tribes, to be brutish, barbaric, dumb, and violent. Most of the time, they're used in sourcebooks as the enemy you'd come across traveling that attacks purely because they have an itch to kill something. To quote, orcs gather in tribes that exert their dominance and satisfy their bloodlust by plundering villages, devouring or driving off roaming herds, and slaying any humanoids that stand against them. End quote, page 244 of the Master Manual. However, an important note, they are still considered humanoids and have intelligence. Yes, they are shown to be dumb, but they're shown to be dumb to human standards. They aren't creatures or monsters. They're listed specifically as humanoids in D&D canon. Half-orcs are even listed as a playable race. And Drow are also known as Dark Elves. Dark Elves in D&D are known to be elegant, beautiful, otherworldly, all good things. And for Drow, all also are known as evil. To quote, to most they are a race of demon-worshipping marauders, dwelling in the subterranean depths of the Underdark, emerging only on the blackest nights to pillage and slaughter the surface dwellers they despise. Page 24 of the Player's Handbook. Why does this matter? The fantasy races are being depicted in a bad light. Because depicting a race in a set of stereotypes, especially ones that deem them evil and barbaric, subscribe to the idea of biological determinism, which is the belief that an individual's behavior is innately related to components of physiology. This, or unquote, this has been used to justify things like racism and xenophobia. For example, Sir Lombroso, to quote, viewed as the founder of modern criminology, ascribed to crime and deviance to both ethnicity and race. He held that Africans, Asians, and American Indians were especially prone to crime and deviance, end quote. Depicting biological determinism as an accurate way to judge a person's character and how to treat other races influences the audience perceptions on race. To quote, multi-level modeling analysis indicates that both the quantity and quality of the ethnic media representations contributes to whites' racial attitudes, end quote, specifically non-Hispanic Caucasians. Minorities already know who they are and their identity. They know that people within the same race have different morals and attitudes than them because that's how people work. However, the idea of biological determinism has been used since the slavery days in the United States, that the concept, at least on some level, is known to most people. For example, stereotyping and judging people off the color of their skin. The representations of different races and ethnicities can impact a person's perception and view of them along with how to treat races. To quote, indeed, evidence linking media exposure with viewers' racial attitudes has been demonstrated in both cross-sectional surveys and experiments, end quote. This is a study that took 345 most viewed television shows on primetime TV in the US from 1988 and 2008 and viewed how minority races and ethnicities are shown, along with, to quote, using multi level modeling, the results from this comprehensive content analysis then are used to predict national level racial and ethnic perceptions with data from the American National Election Studies, end quote. The results of this study confirmed the hypothesis that media influences the majority of whites' perceptions on race. To quote, the content analysis results with data from public opinion surveys revealed that television representations of blacks and Latinos were associated with subsequent public perceptions of these groups, end quote. Public opinion and white Americans' perceptions can be influenced with what they see in media and how races are treated in media. If they see a favorable person of color, this can elevate the opinion of that race because of that person. However, the opposite is also true. If bad representation is shown an entire race to be bloodthirsty is shown, that can influence a person as to how they view races. To quote, people may learn behaviors through symbolic modeling of stereotypes that they observe in television. The point of all this is to think about the media as a set cultural materials that help us think, act, and do in society, end quote. And as orcs and drow are, to quote, painfully reminiscent of how real world ethnic groups have been and continue to be denigrated, end quote, this can lead to people thinking the same about real world racial and minority ethnicities. My next and possibly my most important point will lead us to the history of media. As historically, media and news have been dominated and controlled by white males. Throughout the history of media, minority races and ethnicities have been forced to find media representative of them by creating their own spaces. To quote, media forms such as newspapers, radio, and televisions were central in perpetuating racist views by representing non-whites as threats to white society, end quote. For example, in the colonial era, the leading way to get news and what's central to politics was newspapers. And of course, this was directed towards the majority of people who were eligible to vote and who held power. White people, to quote. Papers are owned by whites, with primarily white audiences and or white stockholders will produce information that white supremacist society deems important for its primary constituents, whites, end quote. Since white people were in charge and owned the news outlets, it had a lot of white supremacist ideologies embedded in it. And mind you, white people were and never have been the only ones in the picture. Thus, to quote, minority and ethnic communities have worked hard to create their own outlets and to communicate the information their communities find important, end quote. Mind you, this is one example. With this trend of media being filtered and directed towards white people, resulting in a lot of biases in the media, and forcing BIPOC to create their own outlets and safe spaces continues throughout all of history. This same occurrence happened with radio. To quote, certainly radio has been used for propaganda, the mass mediated distribution of misinformation to influence public opinion and collective segment. Yet, we also have seen widespread subversive uses of radio by gendered, ethnic, and racial groups, unquote. And again in television. To quote, racial minorities when combined make up 23.6% of the US adult population, but only about 1.5% of the television stations are owned by them. Whites, on the other hand, own 98.5%, unquote. Despite no official peer-reviewed studies being done on the subject specifically for Dungeons and Dragons, I'm seeing the same trend occur in the small corner of media and entertainment. For instance, I am in a Discord server that was made specifically to be a safe space for BIPOC, and LGBTQ+. And there are over 2 dozen people who join and more are joining on a regular basis. In the other servers I'm in, lots of times moderators have to specify it's a safe place for BIPOC and LGBTQ+. These things would not exist if they were not necessary. Especially since the source material in D&D says that it's okay to use biological determinism and because of those races and concepts are used in gameplay. For BIPOC at the table, that can get uncomfortable, especially because that kind of thinking, those kinds of attitudes and stereotypes have been directed towards racial minorities. It creates an uncomfortable setting and occasionally can lead to confrontation. Nobody wants that when they're just trying to have a fun time have some fun on their downtime. It's much easier to create a safe space where they don't have to endure basic racial stereotypes being displayed and where they don't have to educate someone and possibly even argue. Again, this has been a trend in media for hundreds of years, and even in smaller media such as Dungeons and Dragons, this continues to be the case. I'm not saying that Dungeons and Dragons is responsible for all racism within the community. Rather, the depictions of these races in official content encourages white supremacist thinking such as biological determinism. These are called biases, and everyone has their own internal biases. These biases, like shown in the 20-year study of racial minorities in television, can be lessened or increased based on media consumption. And these biases sadly can make gameplay with someone who has all these biases uncomfortable and unpleasant. And at the worst, it can make it an unsafe space to be in. You can see this from racial minorities creating their own groups and servers that are exclusive to BIPOC in D&D. The same trend that has continued in media since colonial days, where BIPOC are not represented or actually shown in negative lights. Dragons has recently been hiring sensitivity readers for any new content they put out. They've been they stopped printing recently published books and rewrote them to be more inclusive, and have been partnering with companies such as Critical Role that depict races like Drow in a more humanized light that's less racially charged. However, one thing they have not done yet is say why these depictions are being rewritten. The most they've said on the matter is, to quote, "Throughout the 50-year history of D&D, some of these peoples in the game, orcs and drow being two of the most prime examples, have been characterized as monstrous and evil. Using descriptions are painfully reminiscent of how real-world ethnic groups have been and continue to be denigrated. That's just not right, and that's not something we believe in, despite our conscious efforts to the contrary. We have allowed some of these old descriptions to reappear in the game. We recognize that to live our values, we have to do an even better job handling the issues. If we make mistakes, our priority is to make things right." End quote. It was all pretty words, but without giving it a detailed reason why these changes are being made, many people in the community are upset that these changes are happening. Not understanding why biological determinism or why bloodthirsty depictions of races are bad. The Wizards of the Coast to publicly specify why the things they are rewriting are being rewritten, other than, to quote, "descriptions are painfully reminiscent," end quote, of real world ethnic groups. This is a good start, but to many of the audience members, they are unaware of the nuances that come with the content they see no problem with. If the company specifies, then that could bring more awareness and understanding. This would make the community a little bit safer and more open minded for BIPOC within the community.